All right, folks. So now that we're done with the Industrial Revolution, we're looking at what happened to got us into the 20th century. And as you see, 1850 to 1914, a lot of this is going to take us right up to World War One. And one ism is definitely going to dominate this time period. Like before, the early part of the 19th century, we saw the ideas of liberalism and we saw the ideas of conservatism. And we saw the beginnings of two other isms in the form of nationalism that came out of Napoleon and then this desire to unify these areas. But we also saw the beginning of a thing called socialism. Now, all these things are going to roll in together. And nationalism is going to play a really important part in all of these, and to a degree, socialism. But you're also going to see what's going to be the most powerful, especially in the 1850s to 1870s, is a thing called realism. In art, it's realistic art. In politics, it's realpolitik, which what the problem was that all of those ideas that came out of the Congress of Vienna and that concert of Europe system, right? That they're going to reestablish conservative orders and they're going to basically push back those nationalistic liberal ideas and undo the entire French Revolution under the power of conservative monarchs. Well, that didn't happen. In actuality, it fed revolutions. We saw that in 1830. We saw it coming out of, it didn't stop the nationalism in Belgium. Yes, you crushed the Polish rebellion, but it fed the flames of rebellions that are coming in Hungary and other places. It also didn't tamp down, even though the humiliation of Oms took place and a liberal constitution failed to unify Germany, the dream of a unified Germany because of economically through the Zollverein and culturally by a forming Volksgeist, it was all there. And of course, the social reforms that we saw, like socialism, may have failed in France, but there's little inklings of these ideas in what in America would be called the progressive movement. In Europe, in England, you're going to see similar programs pushing through the ideas of social change to help the poor. But the concert of Europe did help lead to an end of slavery. That England is going to get rid of it in the 1830s, and then France, of course, got rid of it before the turn of the into the 19th century, and other countries. And eventually, you're going to see Russia is going to get rid of serfdom in the 1860s, and slavery, as a European concept, ends. And you did create a concert of Europe, which did maintain the balance of power, but it might have caused the war that's coming to be greatly exacerbated. But there was peace, and that peace allowed for an economic reforms and the power of England. So yeah, there are pluses and minuses, but for the most part, the concert of Europe, this Congress of Vienna mentality, failed epically. It didn't stop revolutions. It may have stopped them from fruition, but it didn't stop them. And yeah, it kept the peace, but it made World War One even worse. And yes, it did create industrial revolution, but it is going to allow for socialism and nationalism to take root later. So, all right. So the biggest moment where you know that the concert of Europe had failed is this is what happened in the Crimean War. Russia for centuries had wanted a warm water port. We talked about that with the Greek revolt back in the 1830s. Well, now the Russians are taking that opportunity. They want this part right here, the Crimean Peninsula, right? And they're using that Slavic nationalism, that they have a right to this because they are the same religion, the same culture as the people in this region. That they are the little father that can protect them and culturally. And they use Ottoman Empire's basically stopping um, pilgrims moving to the Holy Land as the excuse for this movement, that they're going to move into the Black Sea to protect the rights of Slavic Orthodox Christians going into the Holy Land. So it's an excuse. What they really want is they're picking off the Ottoman Empire, which is a weaker empire, to increase their political power. Well, that doesn't go well with the French and the British. Now, here's the part again we're pointing out, that the weird part, that this is a conservative Christian nations in the form of France, who's Catholic, and Britain, who is Protestant, backing a Muslim state against another Christian state, but it's not their Christian, right? That the Russians aren't their type of Christian. And then at the same time, that this is not about religion or race. This is about keeping the Russians bottled up in the Black Sea and not getting into the Mediterraneans. The Austrians, who, by the way, have probably the biggest stake in this, stay neutral. And the war, was basically a crap show, that it was not really well planned. It was rushed out. They send out the professional militaries, but they're ill equipped, ill trained. The English are not ready for the terrain. And because it's fought in the Black Sea, their navy's not as effective as it normally is. But it is effective because the Russians are even more poorly planned, that they have little or no equipment, and they were not expecting a French and English army to back the Ottomans. And so, in the end, that after the death of Nicholas I and the bringing in of Alexander II, who's a reformer, the Russians are forced to sue for peace after a long, drag out war. So you see, this starts in 1854. It basically takes 2 years. But again, it's a regional war. It's not in people's back door like what you're going to see with World War One. And these are professional armies that are being used, not draftees. So that fits into this. And in the Treaty of Paris, basically, the Russians get nothing out of it. That Russia emerged as the biggest loser in this conflict. Russia got no longer would control any of the maritime trade in the Danube. And basically the Turks, who are like this falling apart, sickle man nation, is put in charge of maintaining control of these areas, which is renounced by nationalistic forces in Romania and in the Balkan states. And Russia basically has to renounce its idea that it's a Greek Orthodox protector. And so they got done over. They didn't get anything they wanted. No warm water ports. They didn't get a foothold in the Balkans. They actually have to recant the things that they drove this idea of their nationalism. This added to the insult that's coming next, that Alexander II is going to be assassinated, which is going to lead to another of those conservatives. And then we're going to see a massive defeat at the hands of the Japanese in the Russo Japanese War, and the fact of economic downturns and economic power issues, that Russia is primed for a revolution because it is so backward, so falling apart. And politically, it can't gain a footing. Now, why this shows the failure of the concerts, it's simple. Their allies, England and France, are the ones who keep them from getting what they want because of politics and economics. The English don't care about the Ottoman Empire. They keep the Ottoman Empire as a sick old man. And every time the Russians crawl out of their bear cave, Russian bears, they take the Ottoman Empire and shake it in their face to keep them in place. Also, the English are protecting something else. The fear is that the Russians could cross over into India and threaten India, which is one of the English major controls. The French have interest in the Middle East. They're hoping to build a little thing called the Suez Canal eventually, which the English are the ones who are actually going to finish it. But the fear that the Russians could get into the Mediterranean and weaken the Ottoman Empire threatens both England's empire in India and France's control of what they think is the Middle East. And then on top of it, the English eventually are going to get control over Egypt. Again, Russians would threaten those controls that the British have in the Middle East too. So this is more of an economic political power issue than it is conservatism. And again, this is what's going to set up. The Russians feel insulted and they're not going to trust anyone. And this puts them on the verge with their nationalism and their failures, both in the Crimean Wars, two of them, and on top of it, the failures with Japan, primed to go to war. And the English and French are worried about their global empires. So basically, this is the forerunner, that once this concert of Europe, that we're all going to work together crap is out of the way, you've set up World War One. But you've also set up something else. You're also going to see, though, some positive things that did come out of this, besides obviously German and Italian unification, is Florence Nightingale. Is that you're to see and for the she's the Clara Barton in the American Civil War in Europe. Is that Florence Nightingale is going to create the ideas of medical reform for battlefields. The idea that these wounded men need nurses, they need clean bandages, they need food. So it's the establishment of battlefield medicine and eventually the Red Cross in Europe. Whereas she also did one of the very first germ studies that showed that individuals were more likely to become ill during the winter months, which then challenged the way doctors before had approached it. This is a scientific study. They outright rejected her ideas because she's a woman and she's a nurse. But her study is one of the very first germ studies that showed what the conditions, if you change the conditions of the men, you'd improve the survivability based on when they were infected. So this is also going to be one of the very first photographed wars. Roger Fulton is going to photograph this war. And so this sets the stage for what you're going to see in the American Revolution or American Civil War with Matthew Brady and the photography. So, and that's one of the new powers of the cameras. You could see history as it happened. So the Crimean War basically destroyed the concept of Europe. Austria and Russia become enemies, which that might be a problem later. That the Austrians didn't even fight this war and gained power, and that kind of ticks off the Russians. The Russians withdraw from European affairs. Britain now withdraws from European affairs because they feel like they've protected themselves. Austria becomes diplomatically isolated. They no longer have alliances with Russia or France, which makes them open for manipulation by this new power that's showing up called Prussia. And then, of course, Louis Napoleon and France gained great prestige out of this. Napoleon, what they don't realize is that Louis Napoleon, the new dictator that we talked about in the Revolution of 1848, he's kind of an idiot, and he's easily manipulated. And he's going to be manipulated by both the Prussians and by the Italians in the form of Cavour to get what they want in the form of unification. And of course, he's going to support nationalistic movements, and that's what we're talking about. That he gets manipulated by these new players on the map to allow unification. The very thing that France had fought against for centuries of unified Italy and Germany, he becomes a pawn in this game because of the Crimean War. Now, for the Ottomans, well, they're going to try to fix the problem. They put in the Tanzimat, which is a reorganization of the empire, which basically put in liberalized economic systems to allow for more trade and maybe concepts of an industrial revolution. They're going to end the idea of tax farming, where you sold the right to collect taxes, which then increased the debt on lower levels in society. And they're going to allow more tolerance for other religions, which they thought would then increase their power because it would bring in more merchants. They put in the Hatti Hamayan, which spelled out exact rights for non-Muslims. They abolished torture. They did all these things. But the problem is, it's really too little, too late, right? Even though they're going to give local rulers more power and they're going to reduce the restriction on non-Catholics or not, sorry, non-Muslims, which are Catholics, Jews, Orthodox. This attempt to modernize and secularize is actually going to backfire because it's going to create an educated population in Turkey, which is going to lead to a group called the Young Turks, who eventually are going to overthrow and destabilize the Ottoman Empire. And so it's basically it's a sick old man that pieces of it are breaking off, like some type of leprosy, that pieces are breaking off here and there, and it's feeding this nationalistic fervor, which is going to boil over between these areas, between these Austrian controlled areas here and Serbia, who wants these Bosnian Serbs to be part of their empire that the Ottoman Empire had held in check for years, setting the stage again for World War One. Now, France, the Louis Napoleon looked like he's like working for the people, right? He's got the support of the middle class. He's got the support of the army, the Catholic Church. He's going to bring stability. His name's Napoleon. He's the nephew of the other Napoleon, right? And he is going to face pushback by the conservatives in the National Assembly, but he's going to basically overthrow the government like his uncle did in a coup d'etat. He's going to put in universal suffrage. So it looks like, hey, we've seen this story before. He's overthrown the government. He's going to create stability. He's another Napoleon. And then he's elected by plebiscite, male population, vote him in as Napoleon III, emperor, and form the Second French Empire. So bye bye, Second French Republic. Hello, French Empire. So he controls all the armed forces. He puts an authoritarian government. He does put in universal suffrage, so he puts in some economic reforms and political reforms, and he puts in civil service programs and everything. But he's the one who basically controls it. Only he can introduce legislation. They vote on it, but he controls it. It's just like Napoleon, right? But because for once France seems to have this economic political stability in the form of a Napoleon, that France sees a boom between 1852 and 1857, that politically, economically, France is doing okay. You're going to see more investment in the Crédit Mobiliaires, and you're going to see railroads being built and economic growth, and Paris gets a remodel. This is Paris. I think there's a picture here of Paris in here, but that they're going to tear down the old Paris. Sorry, they're going to tear down the old Paris and fix it. He puts in welfare programs, which this is the thing we're going to talk about. Many times these people go back to the old. They go back to solve the worker problems by putting in economic reforms, and that way it keeps the peasants. And now every time he fails, this is the part that every time Napoleon fails in war, he has to come back and calm the people, which then increases the social programs and the political programs to help the lower class and the working class people of France. So, and we're going to see a lot. Like I said, this is the widening of the streets, and this is the uniformality. Like when you looked at England, England's kind of a hot mess. London is. There's stuff all over the place, but France is uniform. Like Paris is uniform because they tear down the old and build the new. But in the process of doing this, they push the lower classes and middle classes out of the city of Paris to the outside. So what you see is this new beautiful Paris, but it's only for the upper level of the petit bourgeois and the bourgeois. It's not for the middle and lower classes. They push them out of the city heart. So the inner part of the city, it's the reverse of what you saw in America with suburbia, that the wealthier people, the middle class, upper class moved out and left the city to die. But then you have today the example would be a gentrification where the wealthy come in and start pushing the poor out again. That's what he's gentrifying Paris, basically. There's strong interest in public opinion during his time, and so that's one of the things he has to deal with. That if he screws up, then it could be a problem. And so trade unions are a major issue for him. And this is this whole problem. We said that every time he goes to war and he doesn't do well, he has to go back and address like domestic issues like lowering tariffs or allowing unions, which then led to strikes. And then eventually he has made his big problem for him, and what caused his downfall is, yeah, he gives off the image of a strong leader, but the problem is France, he wasn't really a strong leader. He waffled. He had the name Napoleon. I always call him New Coke. He looks like Coca-Cola, like a classic Coca-Cola, but he sure as heck doesn't taste like one. He's got all the packaging, but he's not there. That politically he waffles. Militarily, he's a terrible general, and he gets just crushed by the Prussians in 1871. He himself gets captured very early in the war and is forced to surrender, but France fights on, and then eventually they surrender. He's forced to abdicate, but because of his weaknesses, he allows many social reforms to take place. And this is that refacing, like we said, that's that gentrification of Paris. But notice how wide the streets are. That's to stop you from building barricades, and they pave the streets so you can't rip up the bricks to throw it at law enforcement. So France after the Franco-Prussian War, Well, the empire's over, so they create another national assembly, except for part of Paris decides to break away and forms what they call the Paris Commune, that they are a communist state. And for a short period of time, they allow things like universal education, free daycare, equal pay, and then they are all massacred. That the National Assembly sends the troops in, crushes them, kills them all, and this causes a split because the middle class again wants stability, but the working class wanted social economic reforms. Well, by killing the Paris Commune, you've now divided that working class people again. The Constitution of 1875 establishes a bicameral legislature. We're back to a republic again. Unfortunately, this republic is divided in the fact that every single political party you could possibly think of has power, and forming a coalition government isn't very easy. All right. And by 1875 and 1914, that there are more than 50 changes in the cabinet. That because of you have conservatives and liberals and socialists and communists and social democrats and yeah, it's a mess. They can't form a single coalition government that works. And then the Third Republic basically is constantly under threat by Catholic Church and the army and monarchists who want to go back to what was before. So internally, it's falling apart by by a polarity of parties. It's also under threat by outside forces in like the army and the church and that. To make things worse, it decides to shoot itself in the foot. So in 1889, one of its generals, General Bullinger, is actually a letter shows up that talks about how he wanted to overthrow the government in a coup. He denies it, but it looks like you can't, your own system is going to overthrow you. Then the funding in the Panama Canal, those Crédits Immobiliers, as we talked about in American history, are rife with corruption. And in the funding of the Panama Canal, billions of dollars had been misappropriated, and these I'm sorry, it was millions of dollars have been misappropriated, and it was tied to several key bankers. However, it was drafted towards, even though many of the major players economically in France are linked to this fraud, it's actually taken back to several Jewish bankers. And so it feeds the anti-Semitism, even though there are multiple players involved. These Jewish bankers are the ones that are singled out as the cause. So France can't even dig a hole. It can't run its own government because a coalition government isn't working. Then there's an attempt of a coup that's not really a coup under Bullinger. Then you can't dig a hole in the ground in Panama without corruption, and then you blame it on Jews. And then on top of it, you have a blatant example of where the government is corrupt in the Alfred Dreyfus affair. Dreyfus had been a military officer. This is Dreyfus here. Is Dreyfus had been a military officer during the Franco-Prussian War, and supposedly information is found in the German embassy by a spy that links Dreyfus or the French military to selling out its own plans for a cost. Dreyfus is put on trial and found guilty, even though there's quite a bit of evidence that shows he didn't do it. It later comes out that all the evidence was basically wrong. Like the handwriting analysis was completely wrong. It actually linked back to someone else who was actually in the high ranking officer in the French military, had basically selling out. But the fact that Dreyfus was Jewish is what he was really convicted for. He's sent to the French Devil's Island, which is basically a death sentence. They expect him to die. Like all these, the English, the French, all have these Devil's Islands that they go there. They're the worst. The worst are sent here. You know, they're ripe with poisonous snakes. They're full of yellow fever. They're horrible places. Well, all this information about how Dreyfus had been basically fraudulently convicted ends up in public, not it ends up in the hands of the public, and especially Emile Zola, who's a newspaper editor, and he writes a scathing letter called J'accuse that is published in his paper. Well, he's forced to flee to England, but this J'accuse gets out, and it's clearly that the liberal governments and the people who, and the middle, the working class, the liberals, the socialists, and the government all see this as a fraud. They bring back Dreyfus. They convict him again, even though the person who is high ranked confesses he did it. They still convict Dreyfus of the crime, but they don't send him back. They commute his sentence. But then later he is um, pardoned, but it takes like I think he's even dead when they finally pardon him. They commute his sentence, or they basically get rid of his sentence. He's still convicted, and he stays in the military, which is insane. He actually fought in World War One, but it's not pardoned until the 20th century, and I think after he died. And but this was all full of this corruption that the French government has, and there's actually a conflict, with the church, uh, and the state with the ferry laws. That's what the FERRY, and so the empire is the republic is being torn apart. That politically, it's shooting itself in the foot. It also has these multi parties that are tearing it apart. It has a conflict with the church and the government, and the army then is purged. Yeah, of people are seen as a threat out of this, which then leaves them weakened when we get to World War One. And then there's a separation between church and state that the ferry laws basically say that all basically the only form of education is public education, and it denounces private education. That basically you have to go through public education, even the priests do. So France is just a hot mess. It is just a hot mess. Um, so that's him later. And all this leads to an alienation of the working class, that they don't feel like they're getting anything, that the upper class and the middle class are politically driving all this, and it's causing social and political strife. And so that leaves France open for even more rebellions. If it weren't for World War One, France would have probably had another revolution. So now England's the exact opposite. England is like the picture of stability. All right. That is full of economic growth, which we saw in the exhibition, the Great Exhibition of 1871 with the Crystal Palace. They are going to have the longest running monarch up until today in Queen Victoria. She has a lovely husband who promotes economic reform and economic growth in Prince Albert. And so everything seems to be going good. Her prime ministers in Temple and Lord Palmerston basically push for foreign policy growth, which is going to create economic and financial power, economic financial power for England. But two of the most important, conservative and liberal, of the prime ministers is Disraeli, who is a conservative, and Gladstone, who's a liberal. Now, Disraeli was her favorite. She liked Disraeli. Gladstone, however, he may have made her mad several times. And this is why this. Let's go back real quick. Victoria, because she's so long running and because of this kind of love affair with the monarchy that forms during the Victorian age, that it has a social impact, right? That our entire Christmas holiday is a Victorian concept. That the fact of Dickens and the writers during this time period manipulate our ideas of culture today. So England, its economic power and its social power are at its height during Queen Victoria's reign. Disraeli was a bit of a he was a romantic. Which is weird when you think he's a conservative, because they'd be against this, but he was a writer of romantic style. He was brilliant. He actually, even though his family was Jewish, I believe his great grandfather, he also was baptized as an Anglican. So, and his idea as an imperialist, he wants a larger England. His idea is that we've got to get the most empire we can get, is what he wants. Gladstone, well, he is a reformer. He's a great orator, not much of a debater. Queen Victoria, like I said, can't stand this guy. The first thing he does is ask her to fire all of her ladies in waiting who aren't liberal when he comes in. She made him come through the back door and wouldn't meet with him for a long period of time. He wants a smaller England. He wants to concentrate on the internal issues and less outside. So Disraeli's more the imperialist, Gladstone's the reformer. And the biggest problem that Gladstone's going to have overall is Ireland. And we'll talk about that. So Victorian England, one, you're going to see the reform bill. The biggest thing, and this is what we talked about before, this little bit of pieces here, little pieces of there are what's going to create stability. In France, they try to put stability on one man, and it worked for a period of time. Louis Napoleon does create some stability, but then it all falls apart as soon as the facade of Louis Napoleon falls apart. But this idea of reforming small little pieces, of giving the right to vote to male populations that increase 1 million to over 2 million voters is going to help create political stability, right? And it creates this idea that even though my economic wealth isn't that good, at least I have a voice in the government. And so both liberal and conservative parties are going to manipulate the electorates. That's what they're going to do, is the idea of creating this public opinion. Public opinion is the thing that killed the French, right? That with all those newspapers and the J'accuse, it's like they couldn't run from their own failures, and it tainted the public opinion of the lower classes against the middle class and the upper class. Here in France, in England, they're using those newspapers and public opinion to manipulate them, right? To manipulate the population. So if I give you the right to vote, and then I can use my power to get you to do what I want and follow my political party's ideas. And so you're going to see the ideas of civil service exams coming in under Gladstone and getting rid of what we saw later with patronage with the Pendleton Act. They're going to drop requirements for religion, and all these things are to, you know, and secret ballots, like I said, all these things are to basically allow for the masses to feel like they're part of the system. And then once they feel like they're part of the system, the political parties manipulate them to get what they want, even getting rid of the purchasing of military systems. So you're creating, and this, by the way, also is why the English Navy was so powerful in the 1800s. This is why economically they had stability, because people trusted the government. That the lower classes, the bureaucrat, and if you were a common everyday person, if you went to school under the Education Act in the 1870s, you could take the civil service exams and then move up socially. So it was a way of moving up. So you're going to see, like we said, this rivalry going back and forth. And then there's going to be another reform bill in 1884 that basically all taxpayers, if you paid taxes, you could vote. They're going to redistribute and set up demographically so that we know that representation is fair. And then by 1911, all members of parliament are being paid, which then means I could quit my job as a, I didn't have to be independently wealthy to run to be an MP. And that's going to lead to trade unions and all that. I mean, because their power in getting people elected. And of course, you're going to see it, and we're going to see through some of these reforms changing social conditions. It's how England keeps the revolutions down. You tweak the system, and it prevents this constant overthrowing of the system you saw in France. So here's some of the Gladstones. Gladstone, his first ministry, their reform laws, right? They're going to help freely improve themselves to move up, promoting peace abroad. We talked about that. The Army Reform Bill, that's going to stop the floggings and buying your positions. The De-Establishment Act basically said that Irish Catholics didn't have to pay taxes to the Anglican Church. The education reform is going to the biggest things, that once you take children with the Factory Act in 1833 out of the factories, then we need to improve education. That then you're going to see children between 5 and 13 had to go to school, right? The Irish Land Act was one of the things we talked about with the potato famine, was that the Irish felt like they didn't have control of their own land. So this was to get rid of these absentee Protestant landowners, that basically you can't evict the Irish Catholic tenants, right, if you're not living there. The University Act allowed non-Anglicans then to go to college, which allowed them to advance themselves socially. So again, stopping revolutions and creating economic stability by reform. The Secret Ballot Act to make it secret. Then Disraeli The Artisan Dwelling Act basically redefined the minimum housing standards for voting. The Public Health Act got rid of this idea of open sewers and built the modern sewer system. This is where we saw Dr. Snow stops the cholera outbreak by taking the pump handles off. And that this idea of creating a better system of sewage, the Pure Food and Drug Act, before America even had one, because basically there was no regulation on what you ate or drank, and that these people were putting things like dog hair and lice and arsenic in things. The Climbing Boys Act is one of my favorite ones that basically said you can't go buy yourself an 8-year-old and shove them up a chimney. That only adults can be chimney sweeps, not 8-year-olds. Um, this one allowed for protest, and that's what led to the Lucifer Match Factory protests. Oop, here we go. Another Education Act, and of course the Employer Workmen's Act, which allowed workers to sue their employers, which again was what we saw with the Lucifer Match girls, who had these deplorable conditions that were basically eating their jaws away and killing them. They could sue because of the working conditions. And then 1884, we're going to see the extending the franchise to agricultural laborers who didn't own land and didn't make enough or didn't rent. We're also going to see this ending of the rotten boroughs, where basically that demographics need to represent where people lived. But you're not having these really small villages having huge amounts of power, whereas cities like Manchester had less. The biggest problem for Gladstone is this one, is the Irish Home Rule, is that giving Ireland its own ability to make its laws under Parliament. So basically, Ireland would be able to make decisions and then be overseen by the House of Commons. The problem is that multiple times they tried to do this home rule concept and it never passes because you have individuals who are English who own land in Ireland. And on top of it, there's the problem of Northern Ireland. And it never really passes. So we're also going to see, and we're going to go back to the Irish issue. We're going to see the introduction of socialist ideas. The Fabians were very famous, like H.G. Wells, people like that in society who are pushing socialistic ideas. And you're going to see that there's a shift. That Liberal Party is going to become the Labor Party in 1900. And under this Labor Party, you're going to see the introduction of what is clearly socialistic ideas, the ideas of workmen's compensation, pension laws, increased taxes on the wealthy, the National Insurance Act, which allowed for basically unemployment insurance due to like injury. And so this is the beginning of what we're going to see. Liberal becomes labor. And by doing that, these social welfare programs is why we see the modern welfare state. But for the Irish, the Act of Union in 1801 brought the Irish into this as long with Ireland. And they tried to fix this idea of Ireland and giving it its own rule. But unfortunately, between the potato famine and the frustration, terrorism acts start breaking out. And the Land Act, like we said, there's this idea of giving them, like the Land Act said that you couldn't just force people off their land and stuff. That was too little too late. And you're not going to see home rule until 1914. But then World War One pushes this under the table for Ireland, and then it comes back in 1916 with the Easter Rebellion. And the problem is that between that Northern Ireland being Anglican and not wanting the Anglicans to lose political and social power, that's one problem. And it's also the economic ties that there are English who own land there and they're afraid of their investment. And that's what ties up Ireland for a great period of time and causes a lot of animosity and then eventual terrorism and then an armed rebellion in 1916. And then eventually Ireland does get independence, and Ireland's an independent state, but Northern Ireland is still a problem and will be a problem all the way until the um, well, beginning of the 20th century or 21st century. Sorry. Um, Also, you're going to see the beginning of what we call Commonwealth status for places like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and that's coming. But that's not until after right before or right after World War One. Okay. All right. So but like we said, there is this shift in England. Why is there political economic stability? Because England's constantly tweaking. Unlike France, who just like throws everything in the air with the etch a sketch, like we talked about of its constitution, England's constantly changing.